Elements of literary modernism exist in all facilities of media today. But before we can look at what literary modernism is, first we need to look at the surrounding circumstances at its creation with the First World War. With the First World War, there was an extreme lack of resources because everything was being poured into the war effort. Since everything was being poured into the war effort, there was a global economic recession afterwards, which led to an extreme amount of tension between all the major countries. Everyone's trying to stay alive, everyone's trying to stay afloat, which led to an extreme fear of annihilation. Because the fear of self-destruction never was around prior to this First World War. And with the birth of modernism, there was a difficulty dealing with the effects of the war. People were dying, people were bearing their own sons, and there was not enough resources being held around for everyone. And this bled into their media. With their media being as traditional as it was, with the new pessimistic view, everything became depressing, became dark, and came more towards reality as it was then. Which led to the birth of modernism. Modernism is abstract, and everything wasn't that great at the time because people were dying, there was not enough resources, so there was an attempt to escape reality or just express the new harsh realities of this new world. If you can look at these paintings, they are abstract. They exist only in thought, and there's no physical existence to them. If you examine this painting, it's both sad and happy at the same time because people are lazing around, it's all sunny, they're having a good time, but this wasn't the case for the people at the time. This was a reminder of what was owed to them. And this is literally just a bunch of colored squares. So, this was an opposition from the realism art of the previous era. And with the birth of modernism came the death of the Victorian era. The Victorian era was happy, it was cheerful, it was more focused on nature, it was focused on growth, it was focused on progress. All of these things came from, they had the resources. Industrialism was high and mighty at the time, and even public schooling was just introduced by Queen Victoria herself. But with the war, there came modernism. Modernism was more pessimistic because of all the death and decay, and the individual alienation of people was a coping mechanism for their escape of reality. Modern artists of the time include Samuel Beckett with his work for Waiting for Godot, which is two men waiting on a man named Godot, and all these other characters pass them by, but ultimately Godot never shows up. It's subtly implied that Godot is God, which is a dark undertone, basically stating that if you wait for God, he's never going to show up. T.S. Eliot and his work for The Wasteland, which is pretty much a bunch of British contemporary vignettes with a loose interpretation of the story of the Holy Grail and the Fisher King, and F. Scott Fitzgerald with his work on The Great Gatsby. What that was, it was a microcosm of social classes, where if you're at the top, you're fine, you're set for life. But if you're at the bottom, you're never going to go anywhere, and no matter what you do, you will never be accepted by these higher-ups. All of these three stories basically state that they have this dark undertone that you can never really get out of your mouth. There's always this punch to the face that you'll never forget, and there's no hero, there's no optimism, there's nothing. In media today, we still see dark undertones of literary modernism. In films such as Pulp Fiction, Blade Runner, and Birdman, there's no optimistic gratification, and it challenges orthodox expression, and even challenges moral standards. In our media today, we can clearly see the influence of modernism as it did in the early 20th century.